Hello, I'm Bob the Booker, and welcome to my channel. And look, another week, another book prize. And in fairness, I did cover this book prize last year, so I keep on doing this. I keep on apologising for this. This is this is literally my MO. So like, anyway, and the Rathbones Prize is a prize that I read last year, and it's in a slightly different form. When it had a short list of 8 fiction, well, a bit of it's basically, it used to be a prize with a bit of a mix of books, so it would have some poetry, some non-fiction and fiction, all kind of blended in together. This year, partly in a response to the Costa Prize in the UK stopping, it sort of picked up some of the slack of that, essentially. And the Costa used to have a fiction category, a poetry category, and various other little sort of prizes here and there. I think there was a children's one and some other bits. And they would then select an overall winner from those. And so the Rathbones have sort of picked up the mantle a bit of that. And so it has non-fiction, fiction and poetry this year. And I decided, why not read more? And so decided to read the shortlists for those. And so here is me talking about the fiction one. And overall, I've got to say, it's I have enjoyed reading these books. There are a couple that I think I struggled with a tiny bit more than I maybe have than I maybe did last year. Last year was one of my favourite shortlists of any prize ever. I loved most of the books. But obviously, every year is going to be different. It's going to have different authors and different judges even as well. So with that in mind, let's go through a little bit about what was on this list. First up, we have Glory by NoViolet Bulawayo, which was shortlisted for the Booker, which was which has just been longlisted for the Women's Prize, and so it's having a good little year. And so this book goes into the story of this area, and it plays with a lot of the ideas from Animal Farm by George Orwell. It sort of riffs on those notions about what it might look like to have this sort of despotic kind of dictator character coming in and trying to sell this idea to the public and really get them on board for something potentially quite catastrophic. And so we get this real tale in the book of how easily people can be swayed by messages that talk about, oh, we're going to give you more jobs, we're going to give you this new freedom, praise be to our kingdom and to our area and all these sorts of things. And this book slowly turns quite grisly, where lots of things are happening, and things are sort of getting harsher and more difficult in this world. It has this sort of recurring motif of the animals, like Animal Farm, kind of being these sort of sentient, these sort of talking characters, where these animals slowly start to be part of the bigger movement. So there's a sort of Twitter conversation that's going on that leads to some quite nasty and difficult parts of the book. There are this sort of rallying call of praising the nation and sort of being part of the nation. It all sort of then blurs into this thing of how we create this sort of national or local myth or this local story about who we are. And so this is a theme I always find really interesting in books, is that idea of how a nation tells itself about who it is. So, whether that's someone like Salman Rushdie's recent book, Victory City, that talks a lot about the founding myths of a nation and how, talks of this battle that took place years and years ago sort of propel forward this idea of who we are now. We're these kind of people, we're the people descended from Vikings, or the people descended from this group of freedom fighters, or there's always some kind of national myth that people are drawing on of, we're descended from some form of greatness, and that defines partly who we are now. And Glory, I think, really engages with that discussion in a really interesting way of this sort of myth making, but also what that looks like when that myth is routinely challenged by the truth being directly in front of people. Quite often, these sort of stories, kind of like a poking fun at someone like Trump or whatever, of these crowds are huge and people in the audience are sort of talking about something else entirely, and yeah. So that's what I think this book does really successfully. I still really enjoyed it overall. I think I didn't necessarily love this book, But I did think it was playing with some really interesting ideas and sort of furthered parts of the conversation about that, about myth making and various other things. Next up, we have Scary Monsters by Michelle de Kretser. And this is a book that I struggled with and then had a book club where we spoke about it and then revised some of my opinions. I think I still struggled with the book overall, but I feel like I sort of gained some new insights about what the book was doing or trying to do there as well. So the idea is we are presented with two stories of these two different characters in two different historical periods. One of them is sort of this story is essentially from the 80s. She is a young woman who is coming of age, both in terms of, physically and in terms of her age, but also she is discovering who she is, the kind of thinkers that she's influenced by as she's sort of going around Europe and having this trip, but particularly in France and a few other places. And she is learning all about de Beauvoir and Sartre and all these other authors and thinkers, and she's developing her own thoughts from that. And she's there in a period of political turmoil where everybody's convinced that one thing is going to happen in terms of politics, and it's not quite the case. And in the meantime, it's a very slow moving part of the book in a way that I found a bit tricky because I don't think I got it at first, essentially. And what was really interesting in the book club discussion was people talking about what this maybe signified, that this is her coming of age and finding out who she is, but this is a part of her history that is so full of hope. She's looking forward to the potential of a future that is going to be this incredibly liberated one, but it sort of exposes the limits of that thought, that actually a group of people all walking around thinking, well, this is great, Sartre and de Beauvoir and all these other authors are going to teach us about where we're going next, can fall flat if that's not followed up with practical policy or what have you. And indeed, what we see in the second part, and I read them the other way around, so I started with this bit. This is a sort of near future, a sort of post-apocalyptic, in some ways, kind of world, or slightly pre-apocalyptic. The apocalypse is very much now in this book. Where there is sort of complete environmental collapse in some areas. Australia has sort of developed a policy of being anti-environmental policy. So if you do things like recycle, that's seen as being against the government and unpatriotic because the government has no policy on it. There are these fire zones where kind of there's just kind of constantly burning fire. And actually thinking about it, this book was probably written around the time when there were huge forest fires in Australia. In fairness, they happen most years as well, but there was a particularly big one, I think, when this book would have been written. And it's very much a world where everything is falling apart, and even, there are policies, for example, they're explicitly anti-Muslim, and so you've got Muslim characters in this book who are really trying to understand how to navigate a world where they either practice their faith very, very privately and only with very trusted people, or not at all, and have to find a way of reconciling that and kind of saying, you know what, it's not safe right now. And so this book kind of plays with that sort of duality of these two different stories, very much with the idea that you read one and then the other, and it's left open to you. I like the way round that I read it. I think that was useful. I think that the only thing being that you then later get this lingering sense of what the future is potentially going to hold. And you obviously feel a bit grim about what that might be because you've just had somebody tell you all these horrible things that have just happened. So I think despite my initial struggle with the book, I think overall my reading experience was still one of struggle, but there are some really, again, interesting ideas coming out in this book that I think are fascinating and really interesting to see an author play with some of those as well. Then you get a book that I ranted about a bit recently, or sort of rambled about. I struggled with this, Pure Colour by Sheila Heti. And again, I think the thing that unites the 5 books on this shortlist is really how they play with big ideas around big issues. And so I'm not going to fault Sheila Heti for the kind of ambition of what she was going for here. I just really didn't get along with this book. So essentially the part of the sort of main premise, I guess, is this book deals a lot with loss. And it's a way of, this is a really strong light coming in. This is, there we go. some kind of afternoon glow as I'm saying this. I don't know if this is trying to stop me from talking about Sheila Heti, but there we go. So this book talks a lot about loss, and there are these really poignant scenes about her father's death, or the main character's father's death. And in it, this character, Mira, Mira deals a lot with how she approaches the death, and she wants to withdraw from the world. She wants to cut herself off. She wants to stop feeling for a bit. And these passages I found really profound and really beautiful. Even, you know, I will follow her a little bit here, but the character wants to be a leaf, and she imagines being a leaf, and in that process it's this idea of sort of becoming fixed and sort of fragile and kind of passive, and that's her way of dealing with grief. And I thought it was, you know, I'm like, okay, a little bit odd. I will follow you on this. I'm gonna go with you here. I don't know if I necessarily found that successful overall, because I think it was interrupted by other bits happening in the book. And I think this is my main gripe with the book, is that there are these beautiful passages that are so profound and wise and thoughtful, and then there'll be something kind of silly almost, or kind of throwaway, that I feel muddies the water of what this book maybe could have been. So for example, there is a part at the beginning about bear eggs, bird eggs, or fish eggs, I think it is, and that you're one of those things. You're kind of you're basically like earth, sea, sky kind of thing. You're one of those three, and that defines a little bit about who you are as a person. And my frustration was that was introduced at the beginning of the book, and then I didn't really ever fully see the relevance of it. It felt like a throwaway thing, that if that had been cut and if we'd focused on something else elsewhere in the book, I think I would have really warmed to this book. But instead, I think I sort of started off with a bad taste in my mouth. All of that said, I know that lots of people really enjoy Sheila Heti, and I really commend what the book is doing in terms of going for these other ideas and being quite experimental and being quite playful. For me, just the playful elements didn't add something. I kind of want the playfulness of a book to, like, for function and form to fit each other, right? This kind of idea that if you're playing with language, like someone like Ali Smith does really effectively, the playfulness of the language actually leads us somewhere and takes us, it develops the central point of what the book is doing, or is just really fun and engaging for the reader. With this, I found those bits frustrating because it complicated the really real conversations that were happening within the book, and also I felt cheapened some parts. So yeah, I didn't like this book that much, and I do feel bad, but at the same time, that was my reading experience. So there we go. Next up, we have Emergency by Daisy Hildyard. And again, in terms of what I was saying, this is a book that deals with very big issues, but I think does it in a very quiet and controlled way. So Emergency deals a lot with lockdown and sort of coronavirus and various other things. And the way it essentially starts off is this person mostly looking out of their window during lockdown and trying to understand their own life and what's happening more widely. So for example, she might look out of her window and watch nature go by, and she'll have some thoughts about how beautiful everything is, but some thoughts about how everything's going to die. She will reminisce about things from her childhood and that person who she always meant to get back in touch with but never quite did, and those times that she played that video game, and then there's other things that happened. And there's a sort of quiet violence, I guess is the phrase I want to use with this book. I think there's something stirring under the surface that's really quite uncomfortable in this book, as in the character is looking out of the window and there's such a stillness, there's nothing going on, but also everything is going on. Her thoughts are racing, she is unable to really settle in things, and that's maybe also the word I'm looking for, is this book is unsettled. There's so much that's bubbling under the surface that's potentially going to be frantic and dangerous and violent, but also could just be fine, but she doesn't know that, and she's in the midst of lockdown and is really struggling. And so I think this book deals with some really complicated issues in a very interesting way, and particularly takes the ideas of that even further. So for example, there's quite a violent scene involving a rabbit at one point, and there's a shock factor that comes to that because everything else in the book is so still, all with this kind of frantic energy. There's always a feeling that at any point somebody could just decide to start smashing up their whole house, or somebody could just go onto the streets and start yelling. There's this violence, or this kind of anger, or this frustration, or restlessness, and whatever it is, being kept down, and this character is very close to snapping. And I think that's what I found most interesting about this book, is this real cleverness to how the tense and tone of this book is done. So yeah, really interesting one, and probably would be one of my top books from this list. And last but not least, we have Lucy by the Sea by Elizabeth Strout. And so this is the fourth in the Amgash series. So the books including Lucy Barton, My Name is Lucy Barton, and O William, which was shortlisted for the Booker last year. And Lucy by the Sea also deals with lockdown in probably a very different way to Emergency, with fewer rabbits being being killed. And Lucy by the Sea deals with the ideas of how one would go about bringing a family together, or conceiving of what's going on around you during lockdown. And so Lucy, this character who has been sort of established through the previous three books, is kind of at a loss, where she is trying to piece together her life and understand what it might look like, all while lockdown is going on. So she wants to, in some ways, what is the sun doing? She wants to get in touch with people who she hasn't seen in years. She wants to think about a relationship that's recently ended, and she's thinking about what might make sense in terms of getting that back together. Does it make sense to do any of that? It also serves as a bit of a greatest hits in some ways, or an all-stars of other books of hers, where there are Olive Kitteridge, for example, features from one of her other books, and a few other characters from some of her other series and books just appear. And they're kind of in the background sometimes, or they get introduced, or there's a fleeting reference. And so in some ways, this book feels like it's creating this kind of sense of community of when all of this is going wrong, when everything has blown up, basically, and, you know, the world is forever changed. What are the ways that people try to get back in touch? Or how do we think about the idea of what does this person over here need? How do we show people that we're thinking of them? And, you know, there's a lot in here about Lucy and her children, and how she deals with, for example, thinking about their relationships, of sort of, does she intervene to say, you know, I don't think this person is very good for you, or I think you're being horrendous to my daughter, blah blah blah. So I really enjoyed this book, actually. I thought this read like one of the better lockdown novels, in the sense that I think it deals with the very real aspects of locking a population down, and people all being kind of shut up in their homes for long stretches of time unexpectedly. And it deals with that in a really human and very warm way. And I think that's the thing I really enjoyed about this book, is it's very very human. It's full of feeling and sentiment, and there's a real warmth to the way it's told that I think marks it as being a bit different from a few other not quite so successful lockdown books I've read, where sometimes it's told through a kind of a solo lens of, here's why I feel a bit sad. Whereas I think this book is that plus, and how do we find community? How do we find connection in these darkest times? And so those are the 5 books on this shortlist. I realise I've gone into a fair bit of detail on a few of them. This has been longer than I was expecting. I did overall really enjoy reading this shortlist, and also worth pointing out that this entire shortlist is women, which has just been which has been really interesting. It seems quite rare that happens in an open sort of category, you know, that you end up with a whole shortlist of just women. And I think these are some fantastic books. I think there are some really interesting ideas being explored here, often in quite new and inventive and profound ways. I think some of them didn't work for me, as I've probably made clear. But I think overall, I am probably rooting for either Emergency or Lucy by the Sea. I think both of them are very clever books in what they do, and have a level of accessibility to them. Whereas I think potentially something like Scary Monsters or Pure Colour, as much as I really enjoy the ideas coming out in this book, I think they're a little bit more hit and miss at times for me. So yeah, that's sort of my thoughts, I guess, on that. But I urge you either way, if these books sound interesting to you, to check them out. I think it's really exciting to just see a prize really championing some very inventive and clever books, even if I don't necessarily like what's going on in all of them all the time. It's exciting to see books being pushed to the forefront that really challenge you as a reader to think about some of your own perceptions of the ideas being brought up, but also on your idea of what a book can do. And so I do commend the prize for that as well. I've been Bod the Booker, talking about these books. Take care and speak to you all soon.